Good afternoon, and welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex, and today we'll be discussing TWiST Preflight. And apparently I keep hitting the wrong button there already. I'm off to a good start. So this is, if you're new to our GoToWebinar series, if my screen is showing too large or too small, there is a zoom button. I don't think it's actually in the upper left anymore in the current versions, but there should be at the top a zoom button you can use to control how large or small my screen displays so that it fits your desktop okay. There is in the control panel a questions area where you can type any questions you might have. Typically we address this at the end of the Q&A, but if anything particularly pertinent pops up, then I may pause to address it. As mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the next month, we'll put a notice on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. I've also been trying to put those up on our Zendesk support portal as well. So if you have access to that, you should see invitations there as well as soon as we know what we're going to be doing. As mentioned, this webinar will be about Preflight. So we're going to be going over basic Preflight configuration and just some common checks you might want to look at, as well as for the pitfalls of the Preflight process. We're going to talk about how you can generate PDF Preflight reports in either ES or TWiST, routing files based on Preflight results. So for example, if a file doesn't have images that are the correct resolution, maybe it goes down a different path in the workflow. Overloading Preflight settings on the fly. If you want to change something that's in your configured Preflight profile while the workflow is actually running. Building custom Preflight checks based on the JDF standard. There's ways you can extend that beyond the built-in checks that Dalim provides. And then lastly, Preflight and images working around the limitations. So to get started, I think we'll go with a basic Preflight workflow. So I've got a workflow here up in our basic Preflight, and I've got my two tools in here, my input files and my PSCheck tool. And if I go in PSCheck, up front I have the ability off the bat to choose what I want to do to this file. And I can choose to normalize it, which is usually what people are doing if they're running a file through PSCheck. I can Preflight and normalize, or I can Preflight only. And if I choose these, I get different options. So for example, if I Preflight and normalize, I can choose to Preflight and then normalize only if there's warnings and errors, or I can choose to normalize always and just do the Preflight in addition to that as an extra safeguard. So in this case, what I'll do is go in here to my Preflight tab. And basically, this is it. I think everyone on the call here is familiar with the basics of what Preflight is, but if you're watching this on YouTube and you're new to it, it's basically a way of checking these files, PDFs that have been uploaded to your TWiST server, to look for potentially problematic things, such as maybe images that are in a color space you don't want, or text that's too small and in too many separations that you're worried might print wrong on press. It's a way of trying to catch these things as early in the process as you can, so you have a chance to fix them rather than maybe the printer or maybe another device down the line. In here I have the option to choose a Preflight profile and some settings on a report that's generated. If I click on this, I can click this little squiggly icon here to edit my Preflight profile. And this gives me a list of, based on different types of objects that there are, different categories of things I might want to check for. And then within each of those tabs, I have different lists of things I can flag for. And for any of these, I can click on them, and if I use the little yellow icon here, I get that means that would be flagged as a warning. And the red icon here would mean it would be an error. Those are really subjective. You control elsewhere in the PSCheck tool how severe a warning or error really is, but in this case you're mainly just differentiating for your own benefit. You also have, for some of the options here, you have the ability to choose where this gets flagged. So if this is just a white page like this, then it means that it's going to search everywhere on the page, including the bleed area, for whatever that check is. And if I click on this and I highlight that in as green, then it's only going to look for issues within a trim box. One area where I think this comes up a lot is the small font check, because InDesign, typically, if you're exporting a file, they put the small text at the bottom outside in the bleed area that tells you the name of the original InDesign file. And if you don't have that check limited to, I think that check's over here. So if you don't have that check limited to just the trim area, you could have it wind up flagging for things that are outside the bleed, which you might not care about. So for some options, you also have other settings where rather than just a direct on and off toggle, you have the ability to finesse it. So you could say that I want to flag for any font that's below 5 points or above 1,000 points. And basically just like that. Some of them have, for example, there's a regular expression one here if you want to flag on the presence of fonts based on the name. You can type whatever you want in here. So you could say I want to flag for Courier or Comic Sans and have it check the whole list of fonts to see if any of those match. So I won't go too into depth on these actual checks. If there is anything you see that you're curious about, let me know and I can stop and pause on that. But in general, one thing to watch out for in here too is at the bottom there's this Preflight options area that I think we've had folks run into some grief with recently. The Preflight options area down here, maybe they want to exclude color channels. They're on the images thing and they are on the objects thing and they don't want to check for a certain spot color. They might type that in here, whatever Pantone that is. Assuming that's only going to apply for the checks on the screen. But that's an overall limiter. If you look when I toggle through these tabs, this Preflight options it's an overall global setting for the whole Preflight. So if you type something in there, you might wind up excluding channels from all your Preflight checks, and they're basically invisible to the Preflight process then. So it's one thing to watch out for. One other thing to watch out for in here too is when you edit these, it doesn't always sync them up to the server immediately. So for example, I edit this and I don't know if I like the changes I made there, but let's flag a few of these and I'll make that change and I'll hit OK. And you get the warning it's going to overwrite the profile. And you would think normally at this point you'd be good. And if you went ahead then and saved the workflow, then TWiST normally would sync that up. But if you're just editing a profile and you're not editing the workflow, it doesn't always sync those by default. So if you go to Tools, Synchronize, you can see I have a new Preflight profile here that's been edited, but it hasn't been synced. So if you're making changes to a Preflight profile and you wonder why they're not being applied when you try running the check, make sure you may need to manually sync that after you edit if you're not also editing the workflow in the same go. But in any case, we have our profile. This is a standard Gantt workgroup one. So I have a file here that I built years ago. The SMA team wanted a file that failed as many of their Preflight checks as possible. So I tried making a really nasty file. So let's run this through our workflow here. And this is very much an old school, as basic as you can get Preflight workflow here. We're not generating any sort of external Preflight report. All we're doing is we're saying if it finds an error, enter into what we call a work item here. And the work item is where TWiST will pause its process and wait until I review this file before it allows it to go onwards in the workflow. So if I go over here to Windows Work Items, you'll see I now have one of these files that's stuck in a Preflight viewer work item. And if I click the start icon here, then I can enter that into Preflight and take on that work item. And what this will do is this will bring up an area where I can open that Preflight report as a PDF on my computer here. If you zoom in, it gives you several pages here. So my first page, I have a list of all the items based on the checks I had configured in my Preflight profile were flagged in this file. So I've got all kinds of object-based CMYK, ICC-based CMYK, overprint issues, all sorts of things, and they're grouped by the error and warning. I have on the facing page some information about what Preflight profile was used, I guess more continuations of my errors there, and just some general information about the file, when it was created, what PDF version it is, some basic info. Then if I scroll down, I have a little facsimile of my page here that shows me all the different things it flagged based on these numbers up here. So for example, forest, alternate color spaces, not CMYK or gray. I can see where each of those items was flagged on the page. So I can get a good look. And if it's not clear in the case of where you might have layered or overlapping objects, there's also a vector-based view over here where for each object it shows you its coordinates on the page. So you can try and identify it that way as well. And then the one last thing is it also adds bookmarks over here. So for everything it's flagging, I can click on any of these and it'll take me to, and I'll highlight that element that was causing the issue and take me right there. So that's in general. You can tweak the look of these a little if you'd like to in the PDF reports section. If you want to change where the summary, whether that goes at the beginning or the end. If you want to change whether it reports all pages or just some, or change the page size to fit whether you're using A4 letter or units. So you do have some tweaks there you can make to the format of those. But this is a very old school way of working. There are not a lot of cases now where people go ahead and wait for a work item in editor. So what other ways do you have of dealing with these? One thing you could do is, if you're doing this in TWiST, there's a Create Preflight Report tool. So we have Mel add a node here. Maybe the workflow is going on to do something else. Maybe it's going on to trap and do some other things. We'll just pretend that's what this is here. We could add a Create Preflight Report branch here. We'll say if type is DJDF. That stands for Dalim JDF, which is the format Dalim uses for their preflight reports. And then in the PSCheck here, we'll say generate a JDF report on warnings or errors. You can also make this on warnings or on errors, which is why these terms are really up to you depending on what fits your process. But here we'll say we'll generate that JDF report. We'll also say on warnings or errors, add a report in the process log. You could also directly email a report to someone from within here if you wanted. And we'll disable the work item here because we don't want to use that. So what we could do here is I have a network share where I'll put these. So jobs webinar. I'll make this one if no other link matches, because we don't want our DJDF going down that branch too. So now if I drag in my file, I've got this network share up over here. Yep, we can see this forked. You'll see that we do get a pre-flight report in the process log, which is handy if we want to see what happened at a glance. We'll be digging into a little later. That does also get saved into a TWiST table variable that you can then use in like a SetParam and search for specific issues if you wanted to. So you can use that to drive the workflow later on, as we'll be seeing. So this went ahead. This is creating my pre-flight report, and it should have just transmitted that to my, yep, here we go. Same pre-flight report, but it got pushed to that location here on my network share. You could also add like an email tool in there to spam someone if you wanted to get their attention. If there was you could do that, for example, you could have it only do that on errors and then email someone if there was an error so that you're really sure that someone's looking at it if it's a severe issue. So now if you wanted to do this in ES, the workflow is fairly similar. So what I did is let me pull up here. I have a workflow here, basic Preflight ES Connect, and it's the same kind of idea. In this PSCheck, we're not stopping at a work item. we're generating that same JDF report on warnings or errors. And we had to do, since I'm going to be using this through ES Connect, I had to put some links in here to tell. Actually, I should probably turn on my link conditions so those are easier for you to see. So there are these special ES Connect procedures you can use in a link to give a command to ES from either ES Connect or from TWiST. So what this does is the file in this case is going to go on and get normalized or whatever. And that would be what we flag as the high res for ES. And we say use this file as a high res when it comes back. That's been normalized in some way, replace whatever is in ES. We've got the second branch here where we're taking that DJDF preflight report and we're telling ES that that is the preflight report for this file. So now if I go to my ES server here, I'll upload a file and I can show you the workflow in here while it processes. So what this workflow is going to do, try that one more time. Yep, there we go. So my file comes in, we've got a preview generation step here to make thumbnails. We're sending it to ES Connect to this workflow. This procedure is so far exactly the same if you're using TWiST. We have the file gets normalized, it gets preflighted, the high res and the preflight report both get sent back to ES. After that, there's another preview generation step to make an updated thumbnail, and then we've got a check preflight step. And what this will do is this will, in general, you don't need this in there as long as you're getting a JDF back with that set preflight report link. It's going to ingest the preflight report into ES. But this is specifically if you want the workflow in ES to pause until someone looks at that preflight report. And then that's going to require them to approve the file. And then we finally got a delivered step at the end here. So we can see here that this got paused at my check preflight step. If I go in here and I check under preflight, I can view that preflight report either as HTML, which is just the text of it, or I can do PDF here. And it's the same PDF we've been seeing. So I can go ahead and I can approve that or reject that. Actually, I might need to add myself to, there's a special group that you need to be added to in order to approve Preflight. I need to add myself in there. So I'll go ahead and do that. Yeah, any users, no matter where they are in the system that are going to be approving Preflight need to be added to that group. I think it's a bit of a holdover from the older days of ES1 and ES2. But yeah, I went ahead and I approved it, and it's good. Now, there is one pitfall you have to watch out for in this scenario. Actually, I might need to edit my workflow to show it a little better. So, tell you what, let's add I'm going to add an approval step at the beginning just to pause things real quick, because this is one thing to watch out for if you're doing Preflight or TWiST work in general in ES Connect or TWiST. So I'll add my approval step there and add myself as an approver. I should have done this before, but it didn't occur to me. So let me reprocess that. And so now we got our approval step. And let's say I'm annotating this file and I'm marking it up. I'll put something in here that says, so I got a few annotations in here. I'm going to go ahead and this thing's going to go to TWiST to get normalized and preflighted. And then we might notice something strange when that comes back from TWiST. So that just came back. We should have our preflight reports. But where are our notes? Our notes are gone. And this is, we've gotten a few tickets in this recently because it's not something you would expect. It makes sense from a technical standpoint, but it's not very user intuitive. It's the idea of whenever you send a file to something that's manipulating it or changing it, ES counts it as a new stage or a new release of the file. For example, if I send this to TWiST, that might be doing some heavy normalization, or might actually be changing things on the page in ways that those old comments would no longer apply. And ES needs to keep track of every iteration of that file, so that if I decide I don't like what ES Connect did here, and I want to reprocess from earlier on after I change some settings, it needs to keep copies of all those files from every stage in the workflow. So one thing you need to, so the one downside of that is it means that your notes get lost when those stages change. Like if I go up here to view, document view, and I decide I want to view the input stage, you'll see my notes are still there. They're just linked to an earlier stage of the file. But so what can we do about this? If you want to, you might have people checking a file before they pre-flight it. One option you could do is, we've had folks tend to bust their pre-flight and normalization into two separate processes. So what you could do, for example, is set your pre-flight to pre-flight only and drop original file. And just an extra safeguard in case anyone changes this workflow in the future, what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to make this, rather than set high res, I'm going to make it set ignore file. Or edit, I'm going to reprocess this, so I can restart that test quickly. And what this is going to do is it tells ES, whatever happens in this branch, ignore it. If anything comes down here, whatever happens, I'm assuming the workflows, TWiST is going to assume the workflow is going to transmit that file somewhere or do something with it, and it doesn't have to be concerned about it. As soon as it sees this, it stops looking at it. So now what we do is, I guess we're back at the original stage. I'll go ahead and approve this. And this time we should keep our notes, because this time TWiST is only going to be updating the pre-flight report. It's not going to be updating the high res, so we should retain our notes. Yep, and you can see this time our notes came over. And that looks good. Now there is one other way you can handle this, but it only works in eTwist. So what you would need to do is, I have to actually remember how to do this correctly. There is a special JDF command you can return to ES from eTwist only. It will not work with ES Connect, just due to the tighter integration in eTwist. I think it's and actually to check the syntax on my other screen if I think that's what it is. I may have had a correction on top of the video if I got that wrong, but I think it's variables JDF out keep dialog nodes equals true. And if you set the flag that way, it'll tell it basically, it'll still create the new stage, but ES will then copy the notes over to the new document ID so that they persist there as well. So that's one other way of dealing with this. So that's how you create your reports in TWiST and ES. I think next up on the agenda, I'm trying to keep this as quick as I can. We're definitely going to go over once we get to the custom pre-flights. So the next thing on the list would be routing files. We've got pre-flight reports, but that only goes so far. What if we want to push the file somewhere else, or email it to someone, or try to route it to some other tool maybe? If it fails a certain check, send it to a GCR utility, for example. You can route files with There's a few variables that get pushed into TWiST when you preflight a file. So there's one example here. I'm trying to remember what I had set up as a check in here. Was this a, okay. Let me push in here just so we get a example to work with here. So we'll get our preflight. We get our preflight report here. What we also get is there are a few variables that get saved into your TWiST table when you run through preflight. So I have one here, info preflight, which is the full text of the preflight report. We also get info page status is error, message preflight detects error cases. I think there was one in here that usually said like NOK or something. It's hiding from me. Yep, JDF out P status equals NOK. So there's a few different things you can tag on, you can flag on, depending whether you want to find out the text of a specific check, or whether or not it failed overall, or whether or not it was an error or warning or in the clear. So as an example here, this is just a simple check. I have a really nasty file with some wonderful fonts in here that we definitely want to catch. So all this is just checking just for reference to show these is I just have a check under the fonts area for Papyrus. I typoed there, Comic Sans. So what we're going to do here is I'm looking at that preflight result variable to see what kind of result I get. So if the result in there is error, it's going to follow this link with the check variable info preflight result warning. I'm just checking the value of this variable. If it's a warning, it's going to go down this branch to this validity, which is if it's an error, it's going to go down this branch. And if it doesn't match either of those, I'm going to just assume it's okay. So let's go ahead and you can see that that came out okay. If I dump another file in here, I think I've got this one should show up as okay, I believe. And then, of course, rather than validates in a production workflow, you can route those wherever you want to do whatever you wanted to them in that case. Yep. Now, one other case might be you don't care about the overall result there, because that's just a simple variable that's pretty easy to parse in a check like this. What if I wanted to flag for a bad font check specifically? Well, this is, you can see in here that on my file here, it says the font Papyrus with incorrect name is inside trim box. That's the text, the error message. So what I could do is I could use a SetParamFromRE. And what I do with this is I'm starting with by evaluating this preflight variable. I'm looking for the text, the font, followed by anything, followed by with incorrect name. And if I see that, then I know that I have a bad font in the file. So I'm setting up a variable called bad font to true, and that's my flag. So if bad font is true, it's going to follow down to this validate. Otherwise, if that variable doesn't get set, it's going to follow up here. So if I dump this file in here, I'll get rid of this guy. Yep. And you can see this went to the font issue branch. And again, if I were to dump one of these other things in, then I should get the OK. So that's how you can route files to different branches in the workflow. Next question is overloading settings on the fly. Maybe you have cases where you want to, depending on maybe a file comes from a specific customer or there's something in the file that you see, you want to change the preflight profile or change a specific preflight setting. This is one of those things where there's no universal answer. It depends on what you're trying to change, but there's three approaches I'll show you. So the first approach is just overloading the entire profile. So what we've got here is a workflow. I'm going to push my file in. This is the same Preflight we've been looking at for bad fonts. And what I'm going to do here is push my file in. This is just the same check for Papyrus or Comic Sans. But right now I have a profile that says don't catch fonts. So that's not going to flag those fonts. That check's disabled. As you can see here, there's no warning or error icon. So that file went through and it looks okay, but we don't want that. We don't want any Comic Sans in here. So what I'm going to do is in my SetParamFromRE, I have a extra rule in here that says it's just generally for any file name matches .star. If any file comes in, set PSCheck INF Preflight profile to catchfonts.xml. Catchfonts.xml is the name of another Preflight profile that I have on my system, which is the same as the one up here, but it has that check enabled for Comic Sans and Papyrus. So if I unbypass this setparam here, save my workflow, and re-upload my file, what this is going to do is it's going to tell PSCheck to use that other profile I specified instead of the one that was set in the PSCheck originally. And you can see in here it tells you that it's using that different profile when it starts up, and this time it detected that font issue. So as far as the naming, it's just the name of the Preflight profile with .xml at the end normally. Now, one other thing you can do is maybe you only want to tweak one setting. So maybe, for example, I've got another workflow here. I do some housekeeping. And this time, maybe I want to do, for example, I want to flag any images that are in ICC-based RGB. And I want to flag those as they're an error right now. And if I run something through this workflow, then that is going to be treated as an error. So I'll take my really bad file again. If I look at this, it's going to show you'll see the ICC-based RGB is here, number 11. Now what I'm doing here is, and actually I'll run the file while I do this so that it processes quicker. So if that uploaded correctly. So what I'm doing here is, in PSCheck, if you set up, there's this Preflight profile category in the TWiST table, and that gives you a whole list of different Preflight options that you can tweak if your setparam rule matches. So I'm saying, in this case, GWG5 ICC-based RGB image.severity is set with a warning instead of error. And if I look at this newest work item, then we should see that the newest, the ICC-based RGB check is now a warning. I could disable that altogether. If you look at some of the checks in there, there's other ones where you can set, for example, like ink coverage thresholds. So you can set values. You can turn some checks on or off. It doesn't give you everything, but it does give you a good number. And if you're trying to interpret these, there's a file on. Make this a little bigger. It's in Symlinks Dalim 6.0 db exports. This folder contains a whole bunch of files that for every tool they control which settings show up in this list. And in some cases they actually have more documentation than the user interface does. So if I go into, shall do less. it shows me all the values that show in this list. And there's usually comments in here that tell you what they do. So you can see here, number of pages, max severity, change the severity of the pre-flight rule, error, warning, ignore value. Max number of pages, max controls the max number of pages in that check, where you can flag for PDFs that have too many pages. So that gives you some documentation on what these do. I think I didn't get a chance to test before the webinar, unfortunately. I think there may be a way you can add some other options in here, but I don't remember if that works for everything in PSCheck. So that may be a postscript to this webinar at some point. But for now, one other thing is if, let's say you want to change a setting and you don't see it in this list. So one example would be the, I'm trying to think what I had as my example here. I think I did font size. Actually, I'll pull up the workflow and check. It's bad, I can't remember from this morning. So, rewrite profile. Oh, max channels, that's what I did. So what I did was there were these settings that I couldn't find in that list, or I wanted to flag the number of channels in the file. So maybe it's I want minimum, I want to flag the file if it has less than 1 or more than 3 channels. There's no option for that currently in that list in the SetParam. So one thing you could do is a really old school way is to rewrite the profile yourself. So I put some really big, very obvious and very unique numbers in here. So 777 and 888. And then what I can do is those actually get written into the, I think I have the copy of those Preflight rules here actually. Those actually get written in. These are just XML files. And you can see for the number of separations, my max is 888 and my min is 777. So what you could do is you could use, there's a Unix utility called sed, and I'll just echo that for now. What sed has an option, it's basically a text find and replace tool. So with sed you could say, I'm going to take 888 and turn that to 3. And what this will do is it'll search and then replace that value. So you can see here that I inputted this, and when I ran it through sed, my max is now 3. And if you did the same with 777 to 1, then you wind up with a constraint of Preflight check for a maximum of 3 channels and a minimum of 1 channel. So that's a really old school way of doing it. How that would actually look in a workflow would be you can't really edit. You don't want to edit the original profile. You want to have a copy somewhere that you can copy it into the working directory. So I have a copy out of my network share here. And what my workflow does is it grabs that with execcp, it copies that to my TWiST working directory. Then it goes through and it does those 2 sed commands where it replaces 888 with 3 in that file. The -i here tells it to actually write that into the file rather than just output it to the screen. I have another one for 777 to change that to 1 for the minimum of 1 channel here. And then I have that last Preflight profile to tell it to use the copy of the profile in my working directory and set that as the profile. So if I go ahead and run my file through this, I think I'll just run the SMA one. Actually, I think this one had a few. So we get our work item here. If we behave correctly, we get a warning from between 1 and 3 channels rather than between like 700 and 800. Yep, if we zoom in, you can see it did make that change. Number of separations is higher than the maximum of 3. And if you look in the PSCheck, you can see it's using that custom profile in there. So That is an approach if it's a very kind of a hack and slash approach, but if there's something you really need to tweak and you can't do it through the UI and you don't want to change the overall profile, that is an option. One thing you do have to watch out for, though, is if it fails, if, for example, if that copy doesn't work and it can't reset the Preflight profile, it tends to fail silently. In this particular case, it wouldn't have been a problem because my file would have been very obvious. My file would have failed because it didn't have 800 channels in it. But in other cases, that might fail more silently. So that's one thing you have to watch out for and make sure that that profile that you're copying exists. There's no path changed, and that there isn't some issue that could cause that said find and replace to fail. So that's all the basic stuff. Now to get into the fun thing I think a lot of people were interested in is custom Preflight profiles. And due to time, and I'm still trying to get my head around this too, I only have a very simple example, but I think it's a good starting point. And if this is something you want to see in more depth in the future, we can certainly do a follow-up webinar. So, custom Preflight profiles. Now, you're in TWiST, and there's something in here that you want to check for, or there's something you want to check for in your file, but there isn't a check in Dalim's provided ones that fits your needs. Are you out of luck at this point, or are you doomed to go into try and write your own in like a tickle procedure? No, there's ways you can add extra Preflight constraints or Preflight checks to TWiST. TWiST Preflight is based on the JDF, I think it's still the JDF 1.3 Preflight specification. And that basically describes a whole list of things you can check for. And Dalim implements support for all of that, even if they don't have all the rules for every possible scenario defined. So there is, if you're digging into this, there is a massive PDF at that link there that you can grab that shows you all the different things you can check for that I'm going to be going over in this webinar in a little more brief form. How this generally works is you have to build your own, write your own XML Preflight check rules, and you have to place them in a specific file. Symlinks var 6.0 setup, TWiST tools, PSCheck, Preflight, custom rules.desc. There isn't a lot of documentation in this, so if you're trying to find examples, Dalim, I think when they moved from an earlier Preflight format to JDF 1.3, they added some of their newer rules in this format. So there's already a file in that same folder called extendedrules.desc that you can look to as a sort of template to see how Dalim implemented rules. For example, if you're, I don't want to go too much into the nitty-gritty of that file yet, but as an example, I do have it here. And if you're looking, for example, usually what I've been doing when I've been working on this, I've been trying to see how they did certain things in the interface, and I've been copying them. So, for example, here, maybe incoherent boxes. I don't know if that one's in here or not, but so yeah, some of the older checks from, I think, the earlier days of TWiST aren't in there, but one I know was the font check. I think it was under fonts. Yeah, this one. So if I search for font is inside you'll see that there's the text of that check, and you can see all the XML that they coded. And if you find one that has the kind of formatting or the setup that you like, you can usually tweak that to get what you want. But into the actual nuts and bolts of how this works. The JDF Preflight spec analyzes all sorts of every object on the page. Objects get grouped based on what class they belong to. So they might be, for example, annotation, they might be an image, they might be text, they might be a vector object or a page. They're just different groupings for how these, they're different classifications for what things are on the page. And then depending on what type of object a thing is, whether it's a vector object or text, it might have different properties. And those properties can be shared among those classes, but they might, those classes have their properties pertain to, for example, you have a set of properties that relate to images, you have a set of properties that relate to text, You might have a set of properties that relate to stroke. Some of these apply to multiple classes. So the font and the text properties might both apply to a piece of text on page. And each of these, depending on what you're checking, these each have their own specific checks within these property classes, which is really nuts and bolts of it. So just to give a few examples, so for example, anything that has any class that has a colorant property might have information on actual property information on ink coverage, a list of separations on the page. Anything that's a document class might have the author property, the creation date, the file name, a key to tell whether or not it's trapped. And these are all like simple data types, like their numbers or their strings of text or their lists of data that you can perform different operations on. To give a few examples of Dalim extending their own in here as well, you can see for the box property class, they added their box width and box height. They have a font missing one for fonts and text. So they extended the JDF standard a little for their own cases too. There is a PDF. I don't think it's on Dalim's Confluence right now. It's ancient. I have a copy of it here. I'll put on our Zendesk support site when we upload the video. If you want a copy, you can also just email me too for it, or reach out and I can get you a copy, because that's got a list of all the Dalim custom stuff that's not in that JDF spec I listed earlier. But these properties can then be acted on. So we've got properties where we know that maybe a PDF has an author, or we want to check what device or what application created that PDF. We can perform what we call basic pre-flight tests on them, depending on what type of element they are. So, for example, in the name of like PDF author or PDF creator, that would be a string evaluation because we're dealing with a piece of text. You might have an is present evaluation where you want to check whether or not there's something there on page. Does this page have a specific vector object? Or there's Boolean evaluations too, where the big ones for like that would be, for example, a true false, where you're looking at that is trapped key for the page and you're trying to check has the page been trapped. There's a whole list of these in the PDF that goes into. I'll just scroll through it real quick. Probably not worth focusing on, but just so you know what's in that. It was 694. Yeah, this has all the nitty-gritty of what everything in a PDF that you can check depending on the type of object it is. So there's all the definitions of what they are, what type of data they have. If you're going to be building any of these yourself, you're going to be living in this document for a little bit, but that's all the nitty-gritty of these. But depending on the type of property it is, you're running it through one of these evaluations. And then normally you'd be grouping those together in some kind of match conditions. So as an example case, you might have a scenario where you want to flag any Comic Sans type that is smaller than 10-point font. So the way this would wind up working, and it's a little backwards from the way I tend to think, but I've had trouble wrapping my head around it. You're starting with the property, and you're wrapping a test around that property. You're passing the property to the test. So you would have it so you're saying your tests, in this case, is this object text? You're passing the name of every object it looks at to that test. The same for, you'd have that test, you'd pass the name of the font to a test that asks, is this object set in Comic Sans? And then you have a third check here. I have one here where you pass the size of the text to a number evaluation that asks, is this number text size smaller than 10? So that's how these tests kind of end up working. Those get sandwiched in some sort of, if you're doing multiple tests, which you are in most pre-flight cases, you would be nesting those in some sort of match condition. In this case, I have an AND where I'm saying all three of these conditions need to be true. In this case, my for an object to match and flag in my pre-flight condition, it needs to be text. It needs to have a font name of Comic Sans, and it needs to have a text size that is less than 10. You don't have to have one overall. You can mix and match these, and you can nest them. The main types, there's AND, which means all these need to match. You could have an OR, where you could say that it needs to be Comic Sans, or it needs to be 10-point font, and if either of those matches, then it would be considered true. You could also do an exclusive OR, where it would say it has to be either Comic Sans or it has to be smaller than 10 point, but it can't be both. And then the last is not, where anything matched in there, as long as anything in there matches, it would be, the test would be considered a failure. So if I wrapped one of these in a not, I could say, is this object set in Comic Sans? And if I put that in a not, it would say, is this not Comic Sans? And if the font wasn't Comic Sans, then it would flag. So now these get wrapped in, and I'll show you the code of one of these in a minute. But that's how the basic test unit works. But it has to get hooked up to a few other components in order to be useful in TWiST. So in that TWiST file I mentioned earlier, the custom properties, you have to define what you call what's called a pool of preflight constraints. And the preflight constraint is basically any of those checks you see in the interface. So you can see in here that you've got character corrupted, for example. The pool would be all of these taken together, all of these preflight checks. The preflight constraint is the technical name for one of these preflight checks. So that might be check for small Comic Sans, that might be images rotated. Now that has a test in here. That test needs to be linked up to, that constraint has an action that links it to the test. I think this is just in TWiST's sake more of a formality. I was looking through Dalim and I didn't see anything where they did anything fancy with actions. I think it's a requirement of the JDF spec, where in other scenarios you might be able to link a preflight check up to multiple actions, one preflight check up to multiple actions without having to write it in the code multiple times. You also have the ability to, this basically just points the preflight constraint at whatever test it has to do, which is the test we were looking at earlier. We also have to define a UI, which tells how this is going to be displayed on screen. And we have to possibly put some attributes where a user can type in, for example, whether or not they want to, like a value here, like the CT resolution less than a certain DPI value. You define the attributes that can then be passed, or variables basically that can be passed to the preflight test as part of the evaluation, so it's not hard-coded. So to look at an example of one of these, I'll show you an example working, and then we can delve into the code. I know we're going a little late here, so see here, I got my custom preflight.
I'll probably have to drop off in a couple of minutes because I have a hard stop.
Okay, yeah, if anyone else is interested, I'll keep going as long as people are on, but if you got to drop off or something, this will be on YouTube. So I have here my checks here. I have a preflight profile, and this is kind of a silly example here. I was trying to think of a simple example that was easy to work with the test. And so I built a file that has a whole bunch of shapes in it. So, in a bunch of different colors. So I've got a circle, triangle, rectangle, pentagon, and hexagon. So I think the idea, really 1 side, 3 sides, 4 sides, 5 sides, and 6 sides. And maybe I want to flag, and I got those in a variety of colors. Maybe I want to flag any file that has these polygons in it. Or maybe I want to flag specifically anything that has a hexagon that contains cyan. So I've got this here. If I run this file through my workflow, I'll save my thing here. And upload my file here. With any luck, this gets passed to my work item here. And you can see that this got flagged with contains forbidden polygons. And if I go down here, you'll see it flagged these three because they had cyan somewhere in them, and because they were six-sided. But it didn't flag any of these other items. So take a look at how this is set up. I have a presentation. I had to truncate this a little bit to show on screen. If you want the actual text of this this config file, I can send it to you. So just as first basic check here, I have this simple constraint here, flag polygon basic. And I've got several things in here. First off, I've got the name for the overall. That's just the key that identifies this preflight check. That has to be unique. I have a UI defined, and my UI is basic here. It just says check for forbidden polygons. And that's what controlled what showed up in my PS check here. Now I've gotten here, there's a JDF section where you actually define the check. There's for the action I mentioned, which all this does is it links this preflight condition to the check down here. And it also adds, I added a localization here that controls what shows on the preflight report as the name of the flag. So this is what links the test up to this. My actual test is here. And I've got my three basic tests here. My first is name evaluation, where I'm checking the name of every object on the page that the preflight encounters, and like the name of the type of object it is. And if the type is vector, the value list here says which types are allowed, then if the class name is vector, then it's considered a match. Yeah, it seems kind of backwards because you put the result outwards and then you put the test inward inside of that. So you have value list equals vector, and then inside that you're saying take this method. I guess is what you're saying. I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. You're starting with, you're saying on the outside, acceptable values for this test are vector. And then inside that test, you're saying, get the class name of this object. So it seems a little backwards to think about, but that's what that's doing, is checking if the object's vector. I have one here where it's checking the number of path points for my object. And if it's 6, then that's considered a match. And then lastly, I have a string evaluation here for the separation, the list of separations in my file. And if the list of separations contains the value cyan, then it's considered a match. And because these are all linked up at an end condition, then that's considered a match. So in that case, if that matches, then this is considered a preflight warning or error, or whatever I set it as. So my next check is, let's say I want to make that a little more complex though, because that's hard-coded, it's no fun. So what I can do is, this is one of the pitfalls I run into is, first I'm going to copy and paste it into this file. So I have a slightly more fancy version of this, which I'll go ahead and save. One pitfall I run into is that when you're in here, you need to, after you synchronize when you update that file, you need to close and relaunch editor. Because it only checks that file in the interface the first time it loads the preflight editor. So I got to physically quit and reopen after syncing there. We've also had some issues. One thing you have to watch out for if you're trying writing these is sometimes if it doesn't tell you, if you make a typo, it doesn't tell you any errors in the interface. It's just the preflight. I had a few different things happen depending on what I typoed. I had a few cases where the button here would never become clickable. And I had a few cases where my custom tab didn't show up. So we'll go to custom fancy now. So I made a slightly fancier version of this where I want to say maybe I want to flag for forbidden polygons containing between 3 and 4 sides and containing channels magenta and cyan. Because you're not really going to have a case where whatever your check is, it's hard-coded. So in this case, this allows the user to set the check. If I go through, I'll save that profile and I'll push my file in. And we'll see we got our pre-flight warning here. Yep, and this time we get 8 polygons with forbidden channels, and this time rather than the hexagon, it flagged the triangles and squares, and got ones with both cyan or magenta in them. So, and because that's dynamic, because that's set by the user, if I go back in here, and maybe I want to change that to be between 5 and 6, and containing magenta or yellow. Then if I go ahead and rerun this again, then we'll get the different result this time. And you'll see this time we got flagged. It was either yellow or magenta, and we got our pentagon and hexagon flagged and nothing else. So to see how that more advanced rule works, I have another annotated copy. This might be too small to see on screen. I tried to fit it on here so I could annotate it. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. So what we've got here in our constraint is we start off our constraint as flag polygon this time. This time we have attributes, which are values we want to collect from the user. So we've got attribute number 1 is channels. So that's what channels do we want to flag. And that's a string, which is the default cyan. We've got 2 number integer attributes, min sides and max sides, for the number of sides we're allowing on our polygon. Our UI class here is a little more complex this time. It's strange because you have to define your variables twice in here, essentially. You have to do the initial definition up front here, where you define them, those attributes, and then you have to also build them into the UI here as well. So you have to tell it what key it's displaying in the UI for each of these attributes. And then, for example, for this string thing, I built a multi-selector so you could select whatever channels you wanted in here. Columns just tells it how wide it's supposed to be. Then I have, again, my action is just linking this constraint to the test down here. My test is, again, the same kind of setup where I've got 3 conditions wrapped in an end. The first test is the same. It just checks to see if the object is vector. If the object's class name is vector, then it's match. The second is I have another integer valuation. I'm using the $ in the parentheses to specify that I'm using one of the variables up here, and the tilde here to say that that's a range for this integer valuation. So I'm saying that as long as the value is in the range of my minimum size and my maximum size, then it's considered a match for the number of path points in that vector object. And this third one is very different now, because the one before I had a string evaluation where it said that, I think I got that hanging up here somewhere. The string evaluation was if the value of separation list contained cyan, then it was a match. But if you were to edit this and you wanted to add multiple values in, you'd have to do like value equals magenta, which you can't really programmatically do if there's a if you're letting the user select this. So Dalim has their own little wrapper they built called Dalim Software UI Replace. And rather than doing the string evaluation directly, what this does is it takes my choice property up here, my channels, so the channels variable up here, and in this case it's a choice. There's also a match, I think, if you're I think that was if you had like a like radio button or a drop down or something. And the separation list, again, that's the value that I'm checking this against. That's the basic pre-flight test or the property I'm checking. So I'm saying if any of the channels selected by the user exist in separation list, then flag it, then it's a match. And if all three of these criteria meet, then the object gets flagged. So that's about the gist of this. I know that's a very basic setup because I wanted to delve into this a little more, but the webinar turned out pretty crowded. If this is a topic you'd be interested in exploring in more depth, I could try and do a deeper dive in another webinar at some point. If that's the case, then let me know. But one last thing I think I had, which I'll be really quick on, was images in Preflight. Because PSCheck is, with a lot more people using TWiST and ES for images these days and not just PDFs. PSCheck is traditionally meant for PDFs and PostScript, so it doesn't really have any capacity to pre-flight images. But there are a few things you can do if you want to check images for issues. The easiest would be you could use FileCheck. FileCheck has the ability to do a kind of basic validate when you find information that it doesn't like. The standard with FileCheck is you select different things. Normally people use it just because you can get the little notes icon here. Then you can have it write that metadata into memory, so you can scrape information from a file and then use that in program links or whatnot later on. But it also does have the ability for certain things like color space, where you can choose to set a warning or error. And if you set that, so for example, you can do that for color space, you can do that for document producer, you can do that for, some of these are, you can do that for resolution, for example. So what you can do there is, if you have those set, there's an option down here at the bottom that says if error, and you have the ability to just continue on, or you can do a validate, or you can just delete the file. So you can say if it's less than 72 DPI, just delete it. But if you do the validate here, because that's normally set to just continue, which is why I don't think most people look at this. So here, if I've got a image that is RGB, you can see this got stuck in a validate in FileCheck, and the error is because color space is RGB. And it's not as detailed as what you get in PSCheck, but it at least gives you a basic check where you can pause the workflow if anything really serious comes in. You do also have the ability to use some of those FileCheck results in another evaluation if you want. I'm going to have, I had one more. I thought I had one. Now I'm trying to figure out what I named it. Image Preflight. It wasn't that one. If I can't find it, I can't find it. I might not have saved it. It's not any of those. Oh, here it is, I think. That image. So here's one where I'm doing two different checks because FileCheck writes all that information into the TWiST table. So I think if I take one of these files, I'll do both of these and see what it does for each of them. And this is the last thing after this. We'll be wrapping up. I'm trying to keep it as quick as I can. So yeah, both these files wound up being not okay. What I didn't hear is when files go through FileCheck, it pulls out all sorts of information about them. So you've got the file format, you've got the file resolution, you've got margin information, pixel information, which you can then use in the program link or a SetParamFromRE. And I did here, I built a simple mini preflight that does two checks in a file. The first is, so what it does, it starts out looking to see, it sets a base variable. If none of my preflight checks here match, the file is considered okay. My variable image quality is set to okay. Now, I have two checks. The first is I check the document space. If the document space is RGB, then I overwrite that OK value with not OK. And if the resolution of the file is less than 72, then I write it to not OK. So you can see for, I think, this first file, if I look at the SetParam log, both of these made it to not OK. But this one, the document space is RGB. So it failed on that check. It passed the other check here for resolution because this is over 72 dpi. But if you had a CMYK document that was like 50 dpi, then it would pass this check here, fail this check. It would still go to the not OK branch. So now the one last thing is, I guess if you were in a really exotic scenario, and this is the final thing I'm showing today, is if you were in a really exotic scenario here where you wanted to do something and you couldn't get the information from FileCheck, in FileCheck to validate there, or from FileCheck to use in a SetParam, the one thing you could do is you could use an external utility like ImageMagick. So I built something here to check if my file uses zip compression and to flag it if it does. So what I'll do here is I'll upload a file into this. And this file is going to be flagged as either containing zip compression or not containing zip compression. And in this case, it got flagged as having zip compression. So how this worked was I have a SetParamFromRE here. And what this does is this is calling a ImageMagick utility called Identify. And Identify is going to contain a whole bunch of information about the files in a list format. And this is the format that the compression gets listed in, as you have a value. This is compression, and it's got the colon, and then it's got a value if that exists. And I'm saying if that exists, grab the value of the compression variable here, extract just that, and set the compression type variable to that. And if I look at the SetParamFromRE log here, you'll see this is all that identify command returned, all this information about nitty-gritty of exactly what colors were in what individual pixels, geometry, MIME type, channel depth, and it found my, that's really buried in there. That's a lot of information to go through. It's in there somewhere. But because it matched that, it set the compression type to zip. And then I just had a simple link here that looked at that variable. So that's one other way you can route those images if you want to, and you're not getting the information through TWiST directly. So that's all I got. Let's see, are there any questions?
Got a couple here, Alex. First one was, will a pre-flight report work in Apple Preview app?
Yep, a pre-flight report will work in Apple's Preview app if you're not using Acrobat. There is an option when you click on the work item thing to launch, like a work item, for example. There's a preferences in that app where you can choose whatever application you want to open it. So if I set that to Preview, for example, then when I click the little eye here, that's going to open Preview instead.
I think the problem you would get with it is I don't think Preview would show the layers properly the way you do in Acrobat, unless maybe it does. Boy, back in the day it didn't. It looks much better.
Yeah, you have to fight it a little more, but it does work decently. I think the bookmarks were the problem. They were under, I got them to show earlier. I think they were under table of contents.
Yeah, that's quite a bit better than it used to be.
Yeah, it's good, but you still can't, like, if you click on these, it doesn't actually highlight the individual object like it does in Acrobat. Right. So.
Okay, here the next one is, I think, rather tongue-in-cheek. Is the Comic Sans rule an anti-Jude rule?
I wanted to do a check for our tech Jude Oliver to look for any file that contained the text more RAM in Comic Sans, but there's most certainly a jab at Jude.
And the last one, I'm not really sure there's an answer to this, but the question is, why isn't the pre-flight report in HTML like it is in Send My Ad? I suspect that's one of those questions where the answer is because it isn't. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, those are, to that point though, these JDFs that it delivers are interpretable. If you wanted to write your own interpreter for it, you theoretically could. They're plain text. I think they have all the thumbnails embedded, but I think what you need to do is have some kind of application that did like an XSLT transformation on it to format that XML and content in whatever way you wanted. I think we did get a...
In ES, when you view the Preflight profile, you do have an option to view as PDF or view as HTML.
Yeah, there is an HTML option here. It's kind of the old school Mistral way of doing things now.
Right.
But,
and that's the questions.
well, thank you everyone for attending, and have a good day.